The topic of my talk today, and its title is Resisting the Crowd, a Collectivist Approach to Social Bias. Present empirical work from psychiatry, sociology, and developmental psychology points to the existence of a tendency in humans to experience empathy and sympathy, preferentially towards members of their own group and or social privileged groups. Research on social cognition has shown that people often act on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without intending to do so. It has been found that social identification based on social status, race, religion, and gender not only motivates and modulates, but indeed variously biases and disrupts empathetic encounters. Empathetic feelings, for example, towards outgroup members, strangers, or less privileged groups are often reduced or even missing. This is the phenomenon of in-group bias and involves several forms of injustice towards those that are perceived as being outgroup members or members of groups that are considered to be less privileged in terms of social status. And these forms of injustice include ignoring, disbelieving, and penalizing members of these groups. These phenomena raise a number of important questions, and theoretical accounts must meet a number of different criteria for success in explaining, accounting for the morality and the practical concerns that attach to the consideration of this phenomenon. So one general concern is explanatory. How do we explain this phenomena? Why these forms of social injustice exist? How do they work? These questions relate to the origins and workings of such behaviors and attitudes. Another concern is moral. This concerns both to account for the moral relevance of the phenomena, that is, to account for the fact that these attitudes are morally wrong, and to explain what is morally wrong with them. And a fundamental aspect of this is to account for moral responsibility for such bias. Finally, another very important dimension is that of practical utility. This concerns reflection on the interventions that accounts might recommend to mitigate or even eliminate the injustices associated with these social biases. My aim today is to review the main families of accounts of social group bias and social injustice vis-a-vis the three dimensions of assessment mentioned, and also to present an alternative, the collectivist view, that is underexplored in the literature and consider its prospects vis-a-vis these same criteria. So what are the main accounts? One family is that of individualistic approaches. Biases are seen here as the result of individuals' psychological attitudes, that is, association, preferences, beliefs, choices, or other sui generis mental state. These views focus on the inside the head aspects or states of a particular individual that it's biased. A second family of approaches is that of the structural aspects of social biases. So biases are seen in the structural approach as aspects of situations of social injustice, that is, the social material realities where inequities between different groups of individuals prevail. These accounts focus on the beyond the individual or beyond the head features, including laws, institutions, cultural practices, and social norms that create and perpetuate social injustice. Now, it's important to emphasize that in as far as they focus on different aspects of factors of social bias, these views are not to be seen as competing views. Rather, they are more seen or better seen as emphasizing different aspects or prioritizing different aspects in the explanation of these phenomena. As we said, individualistic accounts focus on the psychology of individuals. They postulate states at that level that are causally responsible for the biased behaviors, and they address the three dimensions of implicit biases, which is what they emphasize, the fact that these biases are implicit in terms of such account. So if we go to explaining the first axis of evaluation, they explain the biases in terms of mental states of the individuals that are causally responsible for them. And now, in this way, they might be able to address the proximal causes of social biases, they seem unable to address the distal causes and the origins of them. So causes that are not or are beyond the individual's head. Now, as said, these accounts emphasize the implicit character of this bias, and they claim that these biases are automatic and more or less unconscious and more or less not under the control of individuals. Yet this has been challenged by recent literature. And one of the important findings was that bias attitudes change very quickly, both within the same individual across different times and between individuals across the same situations. So same individual, different situations, different times would have different bias, and different individuals, even in the same situations, might have different bias. This has raised a strong skepticism about whether the phenomenon of psychologically implicit bias really exists, and thus whether any form of psychological explanation is required or suited to explain social biases. If we go to the moral aspects, psychological theories again emphasize this character, individualistic psychology, as the main item through which we understand morality of such attitudes. But they see these attitudes as part of a broader set of cases that are ways of implicitly coping with the environment, ways that are entrenched, automatic, and direct ways in which we engage with the environment, and yet they are not under a direct cognitive conscious control of individuals, such as perceptual habits, embodied skills, dispositions, beliefs, etc. Yet, when we consider this broader set of cases, there is nothing morally wrong with them. So, individualistic account need to appeal to some further fact, that is accountability to others or relations between rationality and morality, to explain what is morally wrong with such behaviors. And because of this, Langer has claimed that an individualistic picture focused on implicit bias fails to call attention to what is morally at stake when individuals make choices in unjust social conditions. Finally, they also focus on the individual when they recommend or even perform interventions to mitigate bias. But the short-lived and fleeting character of the implicit bias at the level of the individual also challenge the efficacy of interventions at the level of the individual. Also, it seems that individuals, because of how they cognitively engage with environment, will always be biased. So most of accounts need to address the relation between environment and individual states of mind to address changing of implicit bias, and they need to focus on the environment rather than the individuals to explain how changes might happen. And this leads us to the structuralist accounts. They are skeptics about the existence of implicit bias or its ability to explain social injustice. They rather focus on the individuals as they live in social environments. So social environments and structures in those environments have explanatory priority, not the minds of individuals. Individuals are only biased because they are in this context, and bias exists in the environment as the result of historical and ongoing inequities in such environments. Thus, these biases that exist in the environment are internalized by the individuals, and their minds take in those controlling images from society at large. One problem these accounts have is how do they account for individual variations, the ones that we mentioned before, and how they account for individuals' agency in such environments, such as the fact that some individuals were very successful in changing those environments or leading changes in those environments. So how do we explain causal efficacy at the level of individuals? In terms of morality, we might grant that moral relevance is best explained in terms of sociocultural historical structures. But how about moral responsibility? Is there no individual responsibility for these attitudes or behaviors? And how do we explain agency behind change and the moral responsibility that comes with it? At the end, we may agree with Sartre that structures without subjects are inert. So structuralist accounts seem ideally positioned to explain what in the structures needs changing, but not how individuals can perform such socially transformative roles. The structuralist account seems idealist at best and hopeless at worst, in considering interventions. Thus, structures without agents responsible for their existence and dynamics seem blind, and agents' mental states without those social structures seem empty. It seems that structures and individuals are thoroughly interconnecting, mutually reinforcing, and neither comes first, neither comes second. It is both at every step of the way. This leads some to try to combine both to give a full account of social biases. Yet these accounts, complementary accounts, inherit the problems of the two other approaches. For example, being psychologically individualistic, they will have problems explaining how we account for the agency of individuals in as far as they are cognitively biased and the variations in individuals. So might we go beyond individualism? A possibility that is underexplored in the literature is that proper plural agents are part of the theoretical posits that explain social biases and social change. This is different from considering individual minds as completely or partially determined by social structures, or individuals as having or deploying individual identities or experiencing group identification towards other individuals. Collectivist accounts of implicit bias explain social bias and social injustice primarily as the result of the actions of collectives that create and sustain cultural practices, social norms, laws, and institutions. According to collectivism, individuals constitute together a plural or collective subject we, and plural subjects are not metaphysically distinct compared to individuals, but yet they are not mere collections of individuals. They are groups of individuals that are organized in particular ways through particular normative structures under which they act, think, and feel as collectives, together with others, and as part of a we. And by forming such plural subjects, by being organized in these ways, individuals engage in genuine new forms of agency, as well as in sui generis forms of thinking and feeling. Now, if we think of the structural features of collective agency or group agency, we can distinguish 4 different forms. Minimal group conditions, that is when individuals that are in a face-to-face situation coordinate in a short-lived manner, both in space and time. We might call these a minimal group conditions, as when they engage in demonstrations, stadium waves, improvised dances, or even only a couple of individuals walking together. Other way in which individuals engage in collective or group agency is when groups are defined through social identities, by having certain mutual expectation, cohesiveness, tendency to cooperate to achieve their goals, shared attitudes or beliefs, and crucially, conformity to the same group norms. A third form is when small groups of individuals jointly deliberate about something they want to do and they carry out that action. Finally, a fourth form in which collective agency can be identified is through focus on institutions. In that case, individuals play a role within those institutions, institutional roles, and they have established decision-making mechanisms based on structures, policies, rules, and so on and so forth. Now, norms, laws, and institutions in this view are not seen as products of individual choices. Rather, they are seen as the ways in which human collectives operate and organize themselves. Social structures, such as social norms, are the products of collective agents or communities or social groups, and the essential means by which they operate. So, focusing on the agency of social groups and how they come to have norms, laws, policies, and institutions offer a different perspective into the 3 aspects of the explanation of social biases that we mentioned. I think it does, and I'm going to argue now briefly that it does. First, consider variation. We saw that this created explanatory challenges, both for the structuralist account and the individualist account. And in fact, there are studies that shows that when we combine isolated individuals' IAT scores, which measure implicit attitudes and explicit attitudes, to construct average social attitudes across regions, we can uncover correlations between these average implicit bias scores and a range of regional outcomes and patterns. For example, living in a highly residential segregated neighborhood is a predictor of racial implicit bias. Now, structuralist accounts account for this in terms of features of people's situations, not their personalities, but the collectivist view can offer an account of such situations in terms of group behavior and group norms, sort of giving a deeper explanation of what this happens in this way in those situations. Collectivism can also address the origins of social injustice and its working by explaining the different mechanisms and scaffolds that in evolution and development account for group behavior. This includes things like map shaping and social cooperation that are used to explain both evolution and development of collectivism, group agency structures. These explanations address questions such as how humans came to form groups, how social norms within groups develop, how they are sustained, how groups structure their environments by creating norms, whether they did it by distributing benefits or spoils within a hunt, say in the hominid evolution. So let me illustrate, flesh out a little bit more this form of explanation by focusing on the development of individuals within cultural groups and cultural practices. We can see that collective intentionality in development breaks in several stages of development, from minimal collective intentionality based on coordination, emotional tuning, and social conformism, to the learning of more sophisticated forms of collaboration, such as following the same norms, having the same social narratives, and following instructions. Through this practice, children go from being introduced into forms of coordination with others, through learning practices, social practices that involve social norms that specify how they are to behave, to practicing within social narratives their practical reasoning. And that practical reasoning can be the base of even further complex forms of cooperative activity with others. All of these activities involve scaffolds. Ecological and cultural environments are scaffolded by different forms of elements, different kinds of tools, such as shared norms, shared narratives, natural languages, but also particular objects that are in our environment. In this view, the institution of social norms is seen as the result of conformism as well as practical reason. So the child born with abilities for social conformism, with this tendency to socially conform to others and being monitored by others to socially conform, those that orient and correct the behavior of children and give examples and function as role models, they learn norms from others, and they progressively exercise also their capacity for practical reasoning in understanding such norms, in reasoning about them. And this capacity develops by jointly practicing it with others in social practice that already contains those social norms. So when it comes to explaining how social norms can be changed, we can see that our normative behaviors, or our way to behave, in which we behave socially, are scaffolded by language, and that our norms shape the way we interact with one another, as our interactions mutually shape the norms and standards we want to endorse and follow in our practices. So in order to account for changes in these norms, we need, which are already norms that are entrenched in our behavior, we need to account for the different layers of social normativity that are involved, from minimal forms that are based on emotional responses and social conformism, to the following of an institution of new norms, through the rational and collective deliberative revision of such rules and norms that then become entrenched again through mechanisms of social conformism. What about the collectivist view on moral dimensions? We saw that individualism is unable to explain the moral relevance of social bias, and structuralism needs some account of how individuals are morally responsible for, otherwise it exculpates them. Collectivism emphasizes the moral responsibility of group agents, and it claims that different forms of group organization may distribute moral responsibility different, and some forms might be more conducive to moral autonomy and control over group actions than others. So collectivism adds a new layer of moral phenomena to take into account that includes new forms of unfairness and injustice, from groups to individuals, from one group to other group, but also forms of moral responsibility between groups and individuals, and between groups, some groups and other groups. When we go to interventions, Interventions at the levels of individuals are short-lived and perhaps inefficacious to address social injustice. Structural changes are the sort of target that we want to have, but they require individuals or some agents to perform the changes. Collectivism focuses on group agency, and it proposes interventions at the level of those group agents or collective agential structures, and claims that those might be conducive to more lasting social changes than focusing on individuals alone. This is to provide, I think, structural accounts with the right sort of agents. So we need to focus our research into different structures of collective agency, and that is key to address which forms of collective organization might help serve more equitable social structures and also preserve them. And already there is interesting empirical evidence that focus on the right kind of structural collective agency can bring more long-lasting results. So for example, face-to-face intergroup cooperation in equitable conditions might produce long-lasting effect in individual biases, as shown by some recent studies. So to conclude, the dominant approaches to social biases face challenges in explaining the workings and origins of biases, their moral relevance, and the dimensions of intervention that are required to address them. The literature could be enriched by considering the role of collective agents in the phenomena at issue, or so I have claimed. But the proposal is not to dismiss the role of individuals and structures in our accounts of social biases, but to advocate for the need to address the complex relations between individuals and social structures by noticing the key role that collective agency plays in mediating between them. At the end, change may be in the cards of the collectives rather than the individuals. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.